Let me start with something important, something structural, something that requires clarity rather than reaction. The Supreme Court made a decision. That decision is being characterized in headlines as reshaping history, as transforming the landscape of American governance, as fundamentally altering the constitutional framework. And at the same time, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene allegedly leaked a phone call with the former president, creating a spectacle of insider access and performative loyalty. These two events are being presented as equivalent moments of political significance, bundled together in the same news cycle, given equal weight in the architecture of public attention. But they are not equivalent, not in structure, not in consequence, not in the way they interact with the systems that actually govern our lives. And the fact that they are being treated as equivalent tells us something far more important than either event individually. It tells us about how we have been trained to consume political information, how we mistake theater for structure, and how we confuse the loudest voices with the most durable forces. So let me unbundle this carefully. Let me separate noise from signal, spectacle from institution, and short-term distraction from long-term structural consequence, because if we do not understand the difference, we will continue to spend our attention on performances while the architecture of power is quietly rearranged beneath our feet. The Supreme Court's decision, whatever the specific subject matter, whether it involves executive authority, regulatory power, voting rights, environmental law, or constitutional interpretation, is not a headline event. It is a load-bearing decision. It is part of a decades-long project to redefine the boundaries of federal authority, to reinterpret constitutional structure, and to shift the balance of power among branches of government and between the federal system and the states. This did not begin with this court. It did not begin with this presidential administration. It is the culmination of a legal and intellectual movement that has been building infrastructure for more than 40 years. The Federalist Society, the careful cultivation of judicial nominees, the strategic litigation campaigns, the funding networks, the academic journals, the pipeline from law schools to clerkships to appellate benches to the Supreme Court. This is not a moment. This is the activation of a long-term strategy that has been laid with the patience of engineers building a foundation, brick by brick, precedent by precedent for a generation. That is what makes it important. Not the outrage, not the reaction, not the social media response or the fundraising emails or the cable news panels. What makes it important is that it changes the rules under which future conflicts will be adjudicated. It shifts the baseline. It redefines what is permissible, what arguments will be heard, what legal reasoning will be considered legitimate. And those shifts do not announce themselves with fireworks. They settle into the bedrock of jurisprudence quietly, and they echo for decades. Now contrast that with a leaked phone call. Representative Greene allegedly releases a recording or transcript of a conversation with the former president. The content may be supportive, inflammatory, strategic, or mundane. It does not matter. What matters is the function of the act. It is performance. It is a bid for attention, for relevance, for visibility within a media ecosystem that rewards loudness and proximity to power. It creates a 24-hour news cycle. It generates clicks, commentary, outrage, and counter-outrage, and then it dissipates because it does not change structure. It does not shift the legal framework. It does not alter the distribution of institutional authority. It is theater, and theater, no matter how loud, does not lay the groundwork for structural transformation. This does not mean theater is irrelevant. Theater shapes perception. Theater influences voter behavior. Theater creates permission structures for what can be said, what can be believed, what can be normalized. But we must understand what we are looking at. We must be able to distinguish between a performance designed to capture attention and a structural change designed to endure across administrations, across decades, across the lifespan of institutions. So let us talk first about the Supreme Court, about what judicial power actually means, and about how constitutional interpretation functions as a long-term architecture of governance. The Supreme Court does not govern in the way the executive governs. It does not pass legislation. It does not command armies. It does not control budgets. But it does something more durable and more difficult to reverse. It interprets the Constitution, and in doing so, it defines the boundaries within which all other actors must operate. It sets the parameters. It determines which laws are permissible and which are not. It decides which rights are protected and which are subject to majoritarian override. It defines the scope of executive authority, the limits of legislative power, and the relationship between federal and state governments. This is structural work. It is the work of defining the game board on which political conflicts are played out. And because of that, it operates on a different time scale than electoral politics. A Supreme Court decision can last for 50 years, 70 years, a century. Brown v. Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, Citizens United, Shelby County v. Holder. These are not just legal cases. They are load-bearing elements of the constitutional framework. They define what kind of country we live in, what kind of democracy we practice, what kind of rights we can expect to exercise, and what kind of power the government can wield. So when the court issues a decision that reshapes executive power or expands the scope of state authority or narrows the interpretation of federal regulatory agencies or redefines religious liberty in relation to civil rights, these are not incremental adjustments. These are foundational shifts, and they are the product of a strategy that understood decades ago that control of the judiciary is control of the constitutional structure itself. The conservative legal movement understood this in the 1970s and 1980s in a way that the political left did not fully grasp until much later. They understood that winning elections was important, but winning the courts was durable. They understood that presidents come and go, congressional majorities shift, but judicial appointments last for lifetimes. And so they built the infrastructure. They created the Federalist Society as a network for identifying, mentoring, and elevating judges who shared a particular constitutional philosophy. They funded think tanks, legal journals, and academic programs. They developed a pipeline of clerks who would work for conservative justices, learn the craft of constitutional interpretation from that perspective, and then move into positions of influence. They cultivated a jurisprudence, originalism, textualism, that provided intellectual coherence and legitimacy to their project. And they were patient. They did not demand immediate results. They understood that building a majority on the Supreme Court would take decades, but they also understood that once built, that majority could reshape the constitutional landscape for generations. This is what we are witnessing now. Not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of a long-term plan. The court's recent decisions on regulatory authority, on executive power, on voting rights, on religious exemptions are not anomalies. They are the predictable outcomes of a judicial philosophy that has been carefully cultivated and strategically positioned over 40 years. That is what makes this important. That is what makes it structural. And that is why it cannot be understood in the same frame as a leaked phone call or a cable news controversy. This is architecture. This is the reconfiguration of constitutional power, and it will define the boundaries of American governance long after the current news cycle has moved on. Let us get specific. Let us talk about what happens when the Supreme Court issues a decision that limits the authority of federal regulatory agencies, or expands the scope of state power, or reinterprets the balance between executive and legislative authority. When the court rules that a federal agency has overstepped its statutory authority, it is not simply adjudicating a narrow legal dispute. It is setting a precedent that will govern how future regulations are written, how agencies interpret their mandates, and how much discretion administrative bodies have in responding to new problems. This has cascading effects. It affects environmental regulation, labor law, financial oversight, public health measures, consumer protection, and countless other domains where agencies have historically had the flexibility to adapt rules to changing circumstances. This is important because modern governance relies on regulatory agencies. Congress cannot write laws that anticipate every specific scenario, every technological development, every market innovation, every emerging risk. So Congress passes broad statutes that establish goals: clean air, safe workplaces, stable financial markets, and delegates to agencies the authority to write the specific rules that achieve those goals. That delegation is what allows government to function in a complex, dynamic society. But if the court narrows the scope of that delegation, if it requires Congress to specify every detail in legislation, then the practical effect is to make regulation much harder, because Congress is slow, Congress is gridlocked. Congress is subject to lobbying, political polarization, and electoral pressures that make it difficult to pass detailed, technical legislation on complex subjects. So when the court says that agencies cannot act without explicit congressional authorization, what it is really doing is limiting the government's ability to respond to new challenges. This is a feature, not a bug, from the perspective of the legal movement that has shaped this court. The goal is not simply to interpret the Constitution in a particular way. The goal is to limit the scope of federal power, to return authority to states and to private actors, and to constrain the regulatory state. This is a coherent ideological project, rooted in a particular vision of constitutional structure and economic liberty. Now, you may agree with that vision or you may oppose it. You may believe that federal power has grown too large and needs to be constrained, or you may believe that modern problems require robust federal action and that limiting regulatory authority will lead to environmental degradation, unsafe workplaces, and unchecked corporate power. But regardless of where you stand, you must understand that this is a structural debate, not a momentary controversy. This is about the architecture of governance, about the distribution of power within the constitutional system, and about how we balance competing values: liberty and security, local control and national standards, private freedom and collective welfare. And that debate is being resolved right now by a Supreme Court that has the power to lock in its answers for decades. Now let us turn to the leaked phone call. Let us talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, about Donald Trump, and about the function of performance politics in the current media ecosystem. Representative Greene allegedly leaks a phone call with the former president. The content of the call may involve strategy, grievances, endorsements, or plans. It may be flattering to Trump, or it may reveal tensions. It may be intended to demonstrate loyalty, or it may be intended to signal influence. But regardless of the content, the act of leaking the call is a performance. It is a message to multiple audiences, to Trump himself, to her constituents, to the media, to potential primary challengers, to the MAGA base. This is how politics functions in the attention economy. Visibility is currency. Access is proof of relevance, and controversy generates visibility. So the act of leaking a private conversation is not a breach of protocol or a failure of discretion. It is a strategic move designed to generate headlines, to assert insider status, and to maintain a position within the ecosystem of attention that surrounds Trump. This is not unique to Representative Greene. This is the logic of performance politics. It is the same logic that drives viral tweets, provocative statements, media stunts, and manufactured controversies. The goal is not to change policy or to shift the structural landscape. The goal is to capture attention, to mobilize a base, to generate fundraising, and to maintain relevance in a crowded media environment. And it works. It generates clicks, it dominates news cycles, it creates outrage and counter-outrage, it reinforces tribal identities and partisan loyalties, but it does not change structure. It does not shift the distribution of power. It does not create durable policy outcomes. It is theater. Now, theater is not meaningless. Theater shapes culture. Theater influences how people understand politics, how they identify with parties, and how they make sense of complex issues. Performance politics can normalize language, shift norms, and create permission structures for what can be said and done. But we must be clear about what it is. It is not governance. It is not structural transformation. It is the generation of attention and the performance of loyalty within a particular political subculture. And when we treat theater as equivalent to structural change, when we give a leaked phone call the same weight as a Supreme Court decision, we are making a category error. We are confusing noise with signal, spectacle with institution, and short-term distraction with long-term consequence. Here is what is actually happening. There are two systems operating simultaneously in American politics, and they function on entirely different timescales and according to entirely different logics. The first system is the system of governance. This is the architecture of power, the Constitution, the separation of powers, the federal structure, the administrative state, the courts, the regulatory agencies, the bureaucracies that implement policy. This system moves slowly. It is built on precedent, procedure, and institutional continuity. It changes through legislation, judicial interpretation, executive orders, and administrative rulemaking. It is difficult to see in real time because it does not announce itself with drama, but it is the foundation on which everything else rests. The second system is the system of attention. This is the media ecosystem, the social media platforms, the cable news networks, the viral moments, the controversies, the scandals, the performances. This system moves fast. It rewards loudness, provocation, and emotional intensity. It is built on engagement metrics, clicks, shares, and outrage. It changes constantly, cycling through new stories, new villains, new heroes, new dramas. Both systems are real. Both systems matter, but they matter in different ways and on different timescales. The system of governance determines what laws get passed, what regulations get enforced, what rights get protected, and what power the government can wield. The system of attention determines what people talk about, what they believe, what they fear, and how they understand the political world. And here's the critical point. The system of attention is designed to distract from the system of governance. Not deliberately, not through conspiracy, but structurally, because the system of attention rewards drama and governance is not dramatic. The system of attention rewards novelty, and structural change is slow. The system of attention rewards personalities, and institutions are impersonal. So we get a news cycle that treats a leaked phone call and a Supreme Court decision as equivalent events because they both generate attention, even though one is theater and the other is structural transformation. And the effect of this is that the people who understand the difference, who know how to work within the system of governance while performing within the system of attention, gain asymmetric power. They can reshape the constitutional landscape while everyone else is distracted by the performance. Let me be clear about what I am saying. I am not suggesting that the leaked phone call is a deliberate distraction from the Supreme Court decision. I am saying that the media ecosystem is structurally designed to prioritize spectacle over substance, and that this creates an environment in which structural transformation can occur beneath the noise. This is not a conspiracy. This is the logic of attention markets. Media organizations are businesses. They respond to incentives. They need clicks, views, engagement, and controversy generates engagement more effectively than procedural analysis. A leaked phone call with salacious details, insider drama, and clear heroes and villains is more engaging than a legal analysis of administrative law and constitutional interpretation. So the leaked phone call gets more coverage, more airtime, more discussion. And that is fine in a sense. That is how media markets work. But it means that the public's attention is systematically directed away from the structural changes that will have the most durable consequences. It means that the news cycle is dominated by performances while the architecture of power is quietly rearranged. This is not new. This is the same dynamic that has operated throughout the Trump era and beyond. The constant churn of controversies, scandals, provocations, and spectacles has created a permanent state of attention overload in which it is almost impossible to focus on the structural changes occurring in the background. The courts are being reshaped. The regulatory state is being dismantled. The administrative apparatus is being reconfigured. But these changes are slow, technical, and difficult to dramatize, so they receive a fraction of the attention given to the latest outrageous statement or leaked conversation. And the people who understand this dynamic, who know how to use the system of attention to obscure the system of governance, have a significant strategic advantage. They can perform for the cameras while doing the structural work off camera. They can generate outrage and loyalty and fundraising with provocative statements while quietly confirming judges, rolling back regulations, and shifting the constitutional baseline. This is sophisticated political strategy. It is not stupid. It is not incompetent. It is the deliberate use of spectacle to create space for structural transformation. And it works because most people do not have the time, the attention, or the expertise to track both systems simultaneously. They see the spectacle, they react to the spectacle, and they miss the structure. Now, where does Bernie Sanders fit into this analysis? Why does his name appear alongside the Supreme Court and Marjorie Taylor Greene in this discussion? Because Bernie Sanders is one of the few major political figures who consistently tries to redirect public attention from the system of spectacle back to the system of governance. He talks about structures, not personalities. He talks about power, not drama. He talks about economic systems, corporate influence, class dynamics, and the distribution of resources. And he does so in language that is accessible, moral, and emotionally resonant. But that is fundamentally about institutions, not individuals. This is rare in contemporary politics. Most political communication operates within the logic of the attention economy. It focuses on personalities, scandals, gaffes, controversies. It treats politics as a series of individual actors making choices, rather than as a system of structures and incentives that shapes what choices are possible. Sanders, by contrast, talks about billionaires, not as individual villains, but as a class with structural interests. He talks about corporations, not as isolated bad actors, but as entities responding to the logic of profit maximization within a particular regulatory environment. He talks about the healthcare system, the financial system, the political system, and he insists that the problem is not individual corruption or incompetence, but structural design. This is important because it shifts the frame. It redirects attention from the spectacle to the architecture. It asks not what did this person say, but how does this system distribute power and resources? And that question is far more important, far more durable, and far more difficult to answer than the question of what someone said in a leaked phone call. Now, Sanders is not always successful in this effort. The media ecosystem is not designed to amplify structural analysis. It is designed to amplify conflict, drama, and personality. So even when Sanders talks about systems, the coverage often focuses on his tone, his electability, his conflict with other politicians, or his role in intra-party disputes. The structural message gets filtered through the lens of spectacle. But the effort matters. The insistence on talking about structure matters because it creates a counter-narrative, a different way of understanding politics, a framework that prioritizes institutions over individuals and long-term consequences over short-term drama. And that framework is essential if we are going to make sense of what is actually happening in American governance. Let me return to a principle that is central to understanding systems under stress. The most important signals are often the quietest. Loud conflict is not a sign of institutional collapse. Loud conflict is a sign of contested power, of multiple actors with the resources and confidence to fight publicly. What you should worry about is not the noise, but the silence. Not the public battles, but the quiet consolidation. Not the scandals that dominate headlines, but the procedural changes that reshape institutions without fanfare. When a Supreme Court decision is issued, there is initial coverage. There are reactions, op-eds, legal analyses, but then the news cycle moves on. The decision becomes precedent. It is cited in future cases. It shapes how lower courts rule, how agencies write regulations, how lawyers advise clients, and that process happens quietly in courtrooms and administrative offices, far from the cameras and the social media feeds. This is where durable power is exercised, not in the performance, but in the precedent, not in the leaked phone call, but in the legal framework that governs how power can be used. And this is what makes the current moment so significant. The Supreme Court is systematically reshaping the constitutional landscape, decision by decision, precedent by precedent. And it is doing so at a time when the public's attention is overwhelmed by spectacle, when the media ecosystem is optimized for drama rather than analysis, and when the political opposition is often more focused on performative resistance than on strategic institution building. The result is a quiet revolution in constitutional governance. Not a revolution announced with fanfare, but a revolution built through procedure, through legal reasoning, through the patient accumulation of precedents that will structure the boundaries of power for decades. Let us zoom out further and think about the institutional context in which these dynamics are playing out. The United States government is not a unitary actor. It is a complex system of institutions with different mandates, different constituencies, different timescales, and different sources of authority. The president is elected for 4 years and can be removed through elections. Congress is elected every 2 years for the House and every 6 years for the Senate, and it is subject to constant political pressure and electoral accountability. But federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, are appointed for life. They are insulated from electoral politics. They do not face voters. They do not need to raise money. They do not need to respond to public opinion. This is by design. The framers of the Constitution wanted the judiciary to be independent, to be able to make decisions based on law rather than political pressure. And for much of American history, this independence has been a stabilizing force, a check on majoritarian excess, a protector of minority rights. But independence cuts both ways. An independent judiciary can protect rights, but it can also entrench power. It can check the excesses of elected branches, but it can also block reforms demanded by Democratic majorities. It can interpret the Constitution in ways that expand liberty, but it can also interpret the Constitution in ways that protect privilege and limit government action. And right now, we have a Supreme Court that is deeply conservative, ideologically coherent, and willing to overturn long-standing precedents in pursuit of its constitutional vision. This court is not deferential to the elected branches. It is not deferential to administrative expertise. It is not deferential to Democratic majorities. It is confident in its own interpretive authority, and it is reshaping the constitutional landscape accordingly. This creates a structural tension. Congress is gridlocked. The executive is constrained by judicial review. The administrative state is being limited by Supreme Court decisions that narrow the scope of regulatory authority. And the result is a government that is increasingly unable to respond to new challenges, to adapt to changing circumstances, to address the demands of a dynamic society. This is not dysfunction. This is design. This is the intended outcome of a constitutional philosophy that prioritizes limits on government power, that distrusts regulatory agencies, and that seeks to return authority to states and private actors. You may agree with that philosophy or you may oppose it, but you must understand that it is a coherent vision, not a mistake or an accident. Let me place this in historical context. American governance has always involved cycles of expansion and contraction, of centralization and decentralization, of active government and limited government. The New Deal expanded federal power dramatically, creating the modern administrative state and establishing the principle that government has a responsibility to regulate the economy and provide social welfare. The Civil Rights era expanded federal power again, using national authority to override state discrimination and protect individual rights. The 1970s saw the creation of major regulatory agencies, the EPA, OSHA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, empowered to address new social and environmental challenges. But there has always been a counter-movement, a pushback against federal authority, rooted in concerns about economic liberty, states' rights, and constitutional limits. That counter-movement gained strength in the 1980s and 1990s, and it has built institutional power steadily over the past 4 decades. The current Supreme Court is the culmination of that project. What we are witnessing now is not an aberration. It is a predictable phase in a long-term cycle. The question is not whether this phase will occur, it is occurring, but how long it will last, how far it will go, and what kind of counter-movement it will eventually provoke. History suggests that these cycles are self-correcting, but slowly and painfully. The Lochner era, when the Supreme Court struck down labor and economic regulations in the name of constitutional liberty, lasted for decades and ended only when the political and economic crises of the Great Depression made the old constitutional framework untenable. The current conservative legal movement is in many ways an attempt to revive elements of that earlier constitutional vision, adapted to contemporary legal doctrine.